sur le front climatique, le podcast de l'Observatoire Défense Climat.
Hi, I'm Mathilde, Jourde, Research Fellow at the Defense and Climate Observatory. I'm honored to represent the other research fellows of this observatory as the host of this podcast today. Today, it is our great pleasure to interview environmental journalist Peter Schwartzstein, who focuses on the interaction between the environment and security, with special attention to the climate violence nexus. Peter is also a research fellow at the Wilson Center and at the Center for Climate and Security. Peter recently published his first book, called The Heat and the Fury on the Front Lines of Climate Violence. Peter, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to discuss environmental security with you today. So I will start with my first question about your book. And I wanted to know what drove you to write The Heat and the Fury, and what made you want to write about climate security in the first place.
Absolutely. I mean, so I started off as a political correspondent in Egypt in about 2013. And I found that the more that I was working in rural parts of that country and other countries in the wider Middle East and North Africa, the more that I came to think that we were missing what was, to my mind, the biggest story, even in the aftermath of the Arab Spring uprisings. And that was the speed with which the environment and the climate were changing for the worse. And coming from a political science background, I could also see, without even sort of looking super hard, at how that kind of degrading natural landscape was interacting with the political circumstances to sort of pitch people into ever deeper levels of poverty and, in many instances, into degrees of violence. And then after having worked on this subject for 10, 11 years in reporting in about 30 countries and quite a few different sort of conflict zones, I wanted to try and get across to the average man or woman on the street how much violence is already connected to climate change. I mean, even in many kind of corners of the sort of ordinary climate and environmental space, I feel that climate-related violence is still spoken of as more of a hypothetical future threat rather than something that is already a fixture of tens or possibly hundreds of millions of people's lives globally. I mean, I also argue that there are increasingly few forms of conflict out there, including big headline-grabbing ones like in Sudan and Gaza and Ukraine, that don't have some kind of climate component. Now, it's not necessarily a big part. It can often be a pretty tangential part, but it's nevertheless almost always part of the mix. And I feel that the more we come to understand that, quite possibly the greater our chances of actually propelling sufficient action. I mean, there's something about violence that is perhaps capable of breaking through to political constituencies that climate discussions that are seen through the prism of justice or human rights or ecology can't necessarily do so. So I'm also hoping to just reach a slightly different series of political blocks.
Great. So if I understood correctly, one of this book's goals is also to make climate security more accessible to a wider audience and people that are not necessarily familiar with the field itself. So how do you feel that climate security is understood today by wider audiences?
I think, I mean, again, part of this goes to just the classic lenses that we've so often employed. Like it's increasingly known, I mean, extremely well known in many of the sort of urban Western circles in which we mostly operate, that climate change is contributing to greater levels of poverty and immiseration and declining healthcare, declining education, an array of other different outcomes. But I still, just to sort of reiterate, feel that the security component is not well understood. And when it's understood, we don't quite grasp the severity. I mean, one of my book's key takeaways is that we are systematically, well, what I hope will be one of the key takeaways, is that we are systematically underestimating the volume of violence related to climate change because we're not adequately taking into account how climate is acting on other drivers of instability, like inequality, like misinformation, like corruption. And I'll give an example to try and support that. So between about 2014 and 2017, I spent many, many months trying to kind of investigate how ISIS had profited from collapsing agricultural conditions to bolster its ranks. Now, of course, neither I nor anybody else is suggesting that it was a kind of climate-fueled beast alone, but it was certainly arguing that it never would have grown into quite as large a force as it at one point fielded, were it not for climate and other environmental stresses. And I found that some of the greatest levels of ISIS recruitment were in the kind of peripheries of Mosul, in the far north of Iraq, the largest urban center that fell under their control. And that initially struck me as an extremely arresting finding, because those villages were by no means the poorest of the poor. In many instances, they enjoyed access to the kinds of amenities that more geographically isolated villages could only dream of. But what they did have was a strong understanding of the increasing gulf between their fortunes and the fortunes of the people in the city. So at a time of intense drought, their livelihoods, which were almost all connected to farming, were deteriorating and deteriorating and deteriorating. And at the same time, the livelihoods of the people in the city, which were generally much less exposed to climate, were, stagnating or in some instances improving. And that kind of widening gulf was generating all sorts of resentments that ISIS recruiters showed themselves to be extremely expert in leveraging.
In the heat industry, you chose to focus on physical security. Could you explain the reasoning behind this approach?
A lot of it's a matter of optics. The practical being that this sort of roughly 300-page book would have bloated into a 3,000-page monster had I not had a relatively tight focal point. But it's also just that, I've been trying and certainly hoping to reach, those political constituencies who are perhaps more inclined to take climate's national security considerations more seriously than perhaps they would other ones. And so, one of the organizations that I'm affiliated with, the Center for Climate Security, basically made its start by wheeling out retired senior US generals and bringing them to Capitol Hill and looking to kind of persuade climate skeptical Republican members of Congress that climate change was not only real, but it posed serious threats to US national security concerns. And when those messengers arrived in a military uniform, for example, they were just that bit more likely to get across and kind of resonate with the skeptical members of Congress than civilians perhaps would. So I've been adopting what I hope is a sort of slightly similar framing with uncertain results to date.
You mention in your book a new scramble for Africa to describe how rich countries, such as Gulf Arab countries, participate to land-grabbing operations for food security purposes in their own country and develop megafarms in other to secure supply. You also say that 65% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa. How is this process facilitated by local governments? And how do local farmers and communities fight against such land dispossessions occurrences?
So when we have climate-related violence, it's almost always a mixture of climate stresses and poor quality governance. Climate stresses are almost never sufficient to generate violence on their own. And what we have in Sudan is a particularly egregious instance of how poor quality governance can be extra capable of propelling violence that otherwise wouldn't have existed. But similarly, it's a reflection of a different and growing phenomenon, which is the ways in which some states are responding to climate change at the expense of others. So about a third of the book is concerned with the violence that can emerge out of poorly conceived or badly implemented climate action. And what you have in Sudan in particular is quite prolific land grabbing at the hands of mostly Gulf Arab agribusinesses, many of whom are at least partly incentivized by fears of Gulf state food access in a kind of warming, more complicated world. Countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Qatar, countries like the UAE depend on the global food markets for well over 90% of their crop staples. And in a world in which more, mass harvest failures are not just possible, but also likely, many of these countries fear that their capacity to buy sufficient food on the global food markets will be deeply compromised in the future. I mean, we've had serious export bans placed by major food exporters such as India and such as Russia in the past. And there's a fear in the Riyadhs and the Dohas and the Abu Dhabis of the world that there might come a point where no matter of money is sufficient to buy food. And in those instances, countries like Sudan, with kind of at least the appearance of sufficient arable land and sufficient water resources to irrigate that arable land, look extra attractive as ways of gaining control of your own food production. So this is a phenomenon that is slowly manifesting itself, but as climate stresses intensify and as government responses to it become that bit more erratic, and in some instances that bit more unprincipled, this is almost certainly a growing trend.
You also speak about transition minerals and the same process that is happening to secure the supply for the energy transition. What countries have you analyzed as such?
So, I mean, this gets at the kind of the deeply messy, deeply unhappy, I don't know, secrets is not quite the right term, but kind of backstory of the green transition, which is often presented as an unequivocal good, which it's certainly necessary, and the damage and destruction that could emerge out of the clean energy transition is probably a small fraction, a tiny fraction of the kinds of damage and destruction that would emerge out of a world in which climate change is just sort of left to let rip, as we more or less are currently doing. That said, every process has winners and losers, and a process as big as the process of electrifying our economies to sort of wean ourselves off oil and gas will be intensely messy. And certainly, yes, in countries like the DRC and in large other swathes of sub-Saharan Africa, our capacity or our willingness perhaps to extract the pretty massive quantities of critical minerals that will be required without serious human rights and environmental abuses is, I'm not super hopeful of our chances of pulling off that delicate balancing act.
There also have been many talks about water wars in the past decade, and as water stress and security seem to be rising everywhere. Nonetheless, some academics, such as Aaron Wolf, suggested that these alarmist claims may not be as likely as initially thought. So what is your take, based on your groundwork assessment, about these water wars?
So 2 points. The first is that, of course, brilliant water experts and hydrologists like Aaron Wolf have quite correctly poured cold water, no pun intended, on the concept of water wars in the past. And they, of course, have a tremendous amount of historical evidence to support their claims. The vast majority of transboundary water disputes do end with peaceful resolutions, not with conflict. But the 2 points here, the first is that past is not prologue. Like, it's not certain that just because that was true previously, that will continue to be true in a hotter, more complicated world. And this is where I also go back to one of those factors that I briefly mentioned earlier, and that's misinformation. So I was based in Cairo for about 6 years, and through much of that period, I was working quite intensely on the Nile water dispute between Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan. And one of the, particularly at the height of that crisis, 2014, 2015, when it really did look as if Cairo and Addis might battle it out, one of the big underappreciated complicating factors was misinformation. When I interviewed senior Egyptian and Ethiopian policymakers, many of them repeated various conspiracy theories to me. Many of them were repeating things that had been posted on social media but had either no basis in truth or had been distorted in such a way as to kind of misrepresent the other's actions. And that kind of cascading ignorance is intensely problematic. And misinformation and disinformation are, in this, post-truth world, perhaps only going to become bigger fixtures of our political landscape. But the second point is, while it's possible, and one would hope that this sort of no water wars between nation states trope continues into the future, what we are already very much seeing is much more localized water conflict. And that's because these water conflicts, as water experts like Aaron will certainly attest to, are they dance to a different beat. Local communities are perhaps much more incentivized to violence than nation states, because a country cannot easily pilfer or acquire additional water in a way that a community quite possibly can acquire additional water from a neighbor. Equally, states are often incentivized to avoid violence, particularly because heavily water-intensive industries like agriculture generally actually account for a pretty small percentage of GDP. But states perhaps have a much greater incentive to violence among their own kind of easily coercible citizens. So it's just different incentive structures. In 2015, I believe it was, I spent about 3 months traveling the length of the Nile for a National Geographic investigation. And there was barely a 50 or 60 kilometer stretch of that river in which I was not coming across some kind of low-level, localized water conflict related to a dam, related to a piece of water irrigation infrastructure. Right now we're experiencing more particularly low-level intrastate conflicts than at any point since the Second World War, and an inordinate number of them have some kind of water component.
While most of the cases you focus on are in the Middle East, Africa, or Asia regions, you have also chosen to highlight, based on the case of Greece, that Western democracies are also quite vulnerable today. Recently, this has been illustrated by the deadly floods taking place in Spain, where looters were arrested by the police after trying to steal from shops in the flooded areas. Do you feel like Western countries are sufficiently prepared for the climate violence nexus?
No, for a few reasons. One of which is that even among people who are familiar with the ways in which climate change is contributing to violence, this is still mostly seen as a poor country phenomenon. And there's good reason for that. To go back to something I previously mentioned, this kind of violence is almost always that unhappy marriage of climate stress and poor governance. And those two phenomena are mostly found, or at least found in greater volumes in less well-off parts of the world. But as our own climatic conditions in richer parts of the world increasingly come to resemble those in poorer places, and as, to put it lightly, our own qualities of governance waver that bit more, we too are in small ways already experiencing variations of that violence. And I'll try and unpack this in two ways. So in living in Athens with two Greek anthropologist colleagues, we've been working over the last year or two to try and better understand how extreme heat and violence against women are related. And what we found thus far is a probably 300 or possibly 400% increase in different forms of violence against women between the months of June and September. Now, there's a number of reasons that are not related to extreme heat itself as to why summer is a particularly precarious period. Kids are not in school. There's often greater financial hardship. Nevertheless, among the 100 and something women that we've interviewed intensely to date, a large majority of them have invoked some kind of heat component that they suspected to be behind their aggressors' actions. Equally, and this is perhaps the more macro level, when I'm sometimes asked what is the biggest security risk emerging out of climate change, I say anti-state sentiment, declining state legitimacy. And by that I mean the ways in which extreme weather events are eating away at a state's ability to provide adequate infrastructure, sufficient freshwater access, sufficient sewage disposal. And if you look at kind of our living standards here in the West, a lot of the kind of greatest unhappiness at government or at states emerges when there is a kind of gulf between what the citizen expects and what the state can provide. And given how entitled, I don't mean that in a loaded way, but how entitled, and given the high expectations that we, particularly in Europe, but in other rich parts of the world in general, tend to have of government, the very fact that government capacity to provide will probably shrink at least a little bit, or probably more than a little bit, will almost certainly give rise to greater degrees of anti-state sentiment in ways that are extremely dangerous. So no, I think through unhappy experience, we will almost certainly develop a deeper understanding of the conflict climate, or more particularly the conflict instability nexus over the coming years.
There is much talk about the importance of including the environment in peace-building processes. Have you witnessed yourself such efforts in your groundwork experience? and how efficient do you consider it to be?
Well, yeah, so this is, I guess, an optimistic note here. But by and large, what I've written in this book and what I work on across the board is not a hopeful part of the climate discourse. But to simplify grossly, there is a slightly more optimistic flip side of this, and that's environmental peace building. And once more, to kind of speak without a degree of nuance, environmental peace building is looking at the ways in which the environment can be leveraged to prevent, reduce, or recover from violence. And you're sort of killing two birds with one stone. You're both aiming and achieving better environmental and climate outcomes, and you are reducing the kinds of violence that individuals or communities are experiencing. And at a local level in particular, this is a field that's got quite a few success stories to show for itself. So in parts of the Sahel in particular, where I've done a lot of work on farmer pastoralist, farmer-herder conflict, there's been a bunch of really smart, really interesting initiatives implemented by both local and international NGOs, where they have, for example, dug a new well to kind of create a little bit less competition between the two communities, or in many instances sort of created new mediation mechanisms to enable these communities to kind of sit down and better talk out their respective differences. And a lot of the time, trust between these communities has collapsed to such a point that even that they can't kind of create those mechanisms for themselves. And this is where kind of external assistance is necessary. At a kind of nation-state level, this is a practice, environmental peace building, that has fewer success stories to show for itself. But one of the really positive, perhaps relatively, one of the few positive environment and climate things to kind of panning out in the Middle East at the moment is that we're having more and more of these transboundary environment and climate and water initiatives, particularly in the Gulf, where there is something of an understanding that water and other assorted issues cannot be zero-sum game complications. And so even if many of these initiatives are opportunistic and not necessarily meant to get off the ground, even if some of them are probably just extensions of greenwashing, the very fact that states appear to be at least partly willing to disconnect environment and climate from their kind of wider dynamics, from the wider messy relationships that they enjoy with many of their neighbors, is an excellent and very hopeful phenomenon.
So you are speaking about the peace building processes for local communities. Who are the external actors that participate to such processes?
So it's a mixture of international NGOs and local NGOs, often acting with a degree of international funding or international support of some kind. And that's because in so many of the places where both climate and conflict are extra present, government has essentially absented itself, either as a consequence of kind of chronic dysfunction or in some instances due to neglect and general lack of interest. And in these instances, NGOs are often the only kind of bodies that are just about trusted enough, or even the only bodies who are kind of present at all, and in a capacity to sort of help, for example, and as I previously mentioned, sort of support farmers and herders at a time when circumstances are thrusting them against each other. I mean, a lot of the time when I was working on different instances of farmer-herder violence in Burkina Faso and in Mali and in Mauritania and in Senegal and a few other places, it was where state was near totally absent that these incidents were more likely to kind of morph into violence than they were in instances where there was some kind of form of government or some kind of advanced civil society presence that was capable of interceding and helping these struggling communities to sort of resolve their differences in a peaceful fashion.
So we're speaking in the aftermath of COP29 that just happened in Baku. What was the place that was left to climate security during this COP? And how do you think the COP helped to bring about more light on climate security?
So this was the second successive COP in which there was a Climate, Peace and Security Day, which fell halfway through proceedings. And a lot of it, as ever, was purely cosmetic. There was a Baku call for kind of climate peace and security. And the idea that this event was actually going to make any tangible, these events in general were going to make any kind of tangible differences seems kind of unlikely and somewhat far-flung. However, I mean, this COP, of course, was also kind of playing out in the immediate aftermath of Trump's re-election. And this has had many of my kind of counterparts in me sort of wondering, perhaps more in hope than in expectation, but wondering whether the climate security angle might be one of the very few ways of keeping the Trump team engaged on climate. Certainly in 2016 to 2020, US Department of Defense was basically responsible for keeping climate alive within the first Trump administration. And that's because, I mean, going back to the 1990s, the US military has been totally convinced that climate change posed a serious threat to its operations, a real threat to its operational readiness and its base infrastructure. And as a consequence, they were perhaps changing some of the terminology. They were saying resilience and fragility rather than climate change per se. And one might hope that, given that security is one of those angles that is more likely to resonate with the Trump folks, that this could be another opportunity of just keeping them in the room in some, albeit limited, capacity. Again, it's more of a wishful bout of thinking, perhaps, than something that's necessarily grounded in reality. But that's a conversation that's going on.
What do you think the blind spots in climate security are today? What topics in climate security should get more attention?
Well, two of them are perhaps ones that I already alluded to. I mean, there needs to be an understanding that while this is thus far mostly a poor country phenomenon, it will, in a business-as-usual affair, very much become our problem here in Europe and North America and East Asia and every other kind of wealthy corner of the world. So the sooner that we recognize that, the better we can act to kind of minimize the complications that will arise out of it. Secondly, there has to be an understanding that, a lot of the violence that emerges, or insecurity or instability that emerges out of this, is not necessarily kind of big and sexy and sort of headline grabbing. I mean, just another example, in the last few years, there's been a huge increase in olive oil prices, mostly due to climate-induced drought in Spain and other leading olive oil producers. And that massive subsequent increase in olive oil prices has led to a huge increase in theft from olive oil depots and even olive farms across southern Europe. I mean, hundreds of millions of euros worth of goods are being stolen because opportunistic individuals and gangs are incentivized by that higher price. That's, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, not the most tragic of outcomes, but it's just an illustration of how climate is bit by bit bleeding into all kinds of crime and other related problems here at home. But finally, I mean, there's still so much to uncover about the relationship between climate and violence. And for example, in January, I'm going to be back in Iraq and Mauritania with a grant from the US Institute for Peace, looking at what I call the climate intangibles. And by that, I mean some of the ways in which climate is contributing to various forms of trauma, various forms of mental health trouble, which are themselves contributing to kinds of instability. So by this, I mean how everything from the fact that birds are not migrating as they once did, plants are not blooming at the same period of the year, crucially, of course, and most critically, rains are not falling as they once did. All of this is collectively changing communities before their residents' eyes. I mean, there's this newish concept called solastalgia. It's the idea of being homesick without leaving home, because home no longer looks as it once did. And I've become convinced off the back of that decade or so of climate security reporting, that this kind of sense of dislocation, that this kind of the trauma that is emerging from the kind of slow destruction of everything you've known and everything you've ever loved, is contributing to poor decision making, and in turn bleeding into the forms of instability that increasingly characterize so many poor rural areas. So I certainly hope that I and many others are able to kind of better explore this and shed an additional bit of light on another corner of this sorry, sordid world.
Thank you very much, Peter, for enlightening us today about climate security. And thank you for joining us and participating to our podcast. And to our listeners, we highly recommend you to read Peter's book, The Heat and the Fury, on the front lines of climate violence, if you would like to deepen your understanding on climate security impact on conflict and violence. Thank you all for listening to our episode. Don't hesitate to visit our website, défense-climat.com, for more information and content on climate security and defense-related topics.
Allez plus loin sur www.défenseclimat.fr. Ce podcast, développé par l'IRIS, a été rendu possible grâce au soutien financier de la Direction générale des relations internationales et de la stratégie du ministère des Armées.